Miss, what is your name?
Pam Keith.
Okay, and my name is Carlton Cartwright. I'm the Executive Director of the Children's Coalition Incorporated, and we're recording for the Veterans History Project. The only extra person in the room is a young lady by the name of Heather Corbin, and so we're here today with Pam. And let's see, Pam, when is your birthday?
November 3rd, 1968.
Okay, and as I said, today's the second day of July, and we're at the home of Miss Keith. Okay, and what war/branch of service, and what was your rank when you separated, and where did you serve?
I served in the United States Navy. My rank upon getting off active duty was lieutenant. I was promoted to lieutenant commander in the reserve status. I served during the years 1995 to 1999, which were the years right after Operation Enduring Freedom, I think it was.
And were you drafted or did you enlist?
I commissioned.
Mm-hmm. Where were you living at the time?
When I commissioned?
Yeah.
I was living in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And before you did that, what were you doing?
I was in law school.
Okay. And what kind of law were you studying?
Law school is just a general program, so you get a Juris Doctorate in law. It doesn't really have a specialty. You can get a specialty after that.
Okay. And why did you want to join the service?
I had 3 reasons. I wanted to serve my country. I thought that was a very important thing to do. I wanted to travel and go to different countries, and I also wanted to get litigation experience.
All right. Why did you pick the Navy?
They had the best looking uniforms.
Okay. Do you remember the first days of service when you went in?
I do.
What was that like?
Disquieting, unsettling. Didn't know what I was supposed to do, where I was supposed to be, had no idea who I was supposed to salute. It's very scary when somebody salutes you and you know you're supposed to do something, but you don't know what it is. But it was fun. It was very fun, very challenging.
Yeah, the next question is what did it feel like, but I think you just told me. Tell me about boot camp.
My training?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I went to Officer Indoctrination School in Newport, Rhode Island.
And I want to know about your instructors too. Go ahead.
And we were divided into companies, and our group was all staff officers, so it was doctors, nurses, lawyers, people who had specialty education that was used in the service. And we were housed in a very old building that was heated by steam from a steam boiler in the basement. It was very cold at that point. It was one of the coldest and snowiest winters in the history of Newport, Rhode Island. And we had a great group of people in our company. We had a lot of former enlisted people, so they had military knowledge that they could share with us. And we were very physically fit. I mean, a lot of the people in the company were really into exercise, so that kind of lined up with my interests. And so I met a lot of people that I liked and instantly clicked with. And I was always tired. They got us in the habit of getting up at the crack of, not even dawn, like long before dawn. And that was a serious adjustment for me. At the time, I was most certainly not a morning person. So that was challenging. The food was awful. And so I found, I started losing weight because I just couldn't stand eating what they offered. And we were always running from one evolution to the next. I mean, there was always uniform inspections, room inspections, and learning your military history and trying to figure out what all the ranks are and learning all of the things that they want you to learn so that you can look the part of an officer. So that's kind of what the purpose of Officer Indoctrination School was. We were all commissioned at that point, so we were officers already. It wasn't making us officers like Officer Candidate School. So it was interesting because some of us even outranked the people that were training us, but we didn't know anything, so they were there to teach us military comportment.
Okay. Again, I want to go back. Before the military, if somebody asked you, who is Pam Keith? Who was Pam Keith before the service? Where did you come from? You were a military brat?
I was a foreign service brat. So my dad was in the Navy before I was born. By the time I came around, he had already transitioned into the foreign service. And my parents were married in Oakland, and they moved overseas shortly after they got married. And my brother was born in Lebanon, and a year and a half later, I was born in Turkey. And from about 0 to 6, almost to the end of my 6th year, we lived in Muslim countries overseas: Turkey, Morocco, and Syria. So who I was up until I was 6 was just an American kid, and that was really the only thing that mattered about me. I was a girl. In the Middle East, that matters, but mostly I was an American. So that's what I was excited about.
A girl with what that mattered?
In the Middle East, girls are obviously treated differently than little boys are. The expectations for girls are different. But I was a rambunctious and very physical kid. I was a tomboy, and I liked to run and climb and play, and I was fearless as a child, and I remained fearless. I was very adventurous as a kid, very strong-willed, as my parents told me I was precocious, but very strong-willed.
Okay.
And then when I got to be about 6, my parents started going through a divorce, so we moved back to the States with my mom. My dad stayed in Syria because his assignment was not over. So we lived in Oakland with around my grandmother and my mother's siblings. And that was really the first time that I got to know American culture. I had visited the States a few times up until that point, but grandma's house, and for very short periods of time. So this was the first time that I had any significant exposure to the U.S. And I learned that I didn't speak English well. I mean, I spoke it well, but I didn't speak it conversationally. I spoke it at home with my parents occasionally, but mostly I spoke French at school, and I spoke Arabic with my childhood friends. So my English was just not that great. And then when we started school at that stage, I was going to a French school, so I was spending most of my time speaking French anyway. So it took a while for me to be adjusted to speaking and writing and learning English. And then about a year later, my mom graduated from her undergraduate degree. She finished it, and she got a scholarship to go to the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky. And so my mother, my brother, and I moved to Lexington, and that was really interesting. It was 1976, I think, and it was the year that Elvis Presley died. I'll remember that always because it was the day that I learned how to swim. My Uncle Donald came out to Kentucky with us to help us get settled. And his way of teaching us how to swim was to throw us in the motel swimming pool. My brother didn't particularly care for that. I took to it like a fish to water. I just absolutely loved it. And then we stayed in Kentucky. We were the only black family in our neighborhood, and the only reason we were there at all was because my mom had spoken to a realtor over the phone, and the realtor did not realize she was black. And so we were, desegregating a neighborhood without even intending to. And that was the first year my public school allowed black children to attend the school. They had been fighting desegregation since Brown versus Board of Education, and finally there was a decree that insisted that they do the busing of students in. So we were the only kids that attended my school that were not, black kids who were not bused in. And I had a teacher, and I'll never forget her because she was pregnant at the time, and she wore these really weird moo-moo dresses, and she had these cat's eye pointed glasses. And she was my first real exposure to a racist. She was very against desegregation of the school. She put all of the black students in her class in the back row, except me. She put me front and center, and she put just to prove that she wasn't a segregationist. And then she put all the other black kids in the back of the class. And so when she conducted class and she would ask questions, if the black kids raised their hand, she would never call on a black student in the class. She just kind of pretended like they weren't there. And at the end of the grading period, she gave all of the black students C's. And my mom gets this report card, with me with all C's, and she knows there's something wrong. Now, I've never really been academic, but she always knew that I would have the things that I was interested in, I'd always get A pluses, and the things that I wasn't interested in, I'd get really bad grades. But she was used to seeing the smorgasbord of grades because she knew my personality. So seeing C's across the board just didn't ring true for her. So she goes to the school, and the teacher proceeds to tell my mother that she was doing me a favor, that, you know, otherwise I would be all F's. And my mother, you know, got her back up, and she challenged that, and she went to the principal and started making a lot of noise. And by then they had actually gotten one black teacher in the school, Mrs. Poindexter. And so then I was placed in Mrs. Poindexter's class, and everything sort of changed. And she was this lovely, elegant black lady, and I liked her so much. And so I started to improve academically. And but then shortly thereafter, you know, I moved to Washington, D.C. to live with my dad. My mom was having such a difficult time trying to finish her studies and raise children, and, you know, financially struggling. So, you know, she finally decided that it would probably be better for me to live with my dad in a more stable environment and with more resources. And so I went to live with my dad in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is a suburb of D.C. And that was also very challenging. I mean, it was more uprooting for me. And at this point, I'd been, you know, uprooted several times in a fairly short period of time. And I was living with my brother, my dad, and my stepmom. And we were going to a French immersion school at that point. So half of the day was in English and half of the day was in French. And that was the point in time where I lived a more typical middle class existence. You know, I tried the Girl Scouts, and I played the flute in the band, and I was in the school play, and I lived a much more, you know, I walked to school, and Tacoma Park is a very liberal neighborhood, so there were no racial issues. It was just a very comfortable place to be, and a very lovely neighborhood. And it was when I finally, you know, I missed my dad a lot, so it was really great for me to be able to bond with him. And my dad and I bonded in a lot of ways. We would get up in the morning, and we would, on Saturdays, and make pancakes together, and we would sing songs, and he'd tell me stories about the Navy. And that was, I think, probably the first time that I started to realize how cool the Navy was, and I had started to develop an affection for it. And my dad had influenced me so much in those years, because it was teaching by example. You know, he wasn't really lecturing me on anything. We were just hanging out together, and so I would pick up all these things from him. And I'm really thankful for that time. I think that was very, very impactful on me.
Okay. Before we move on with the regular interview, I have one more question. I heard you make a statement about being in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect you? What did you mean about the comment about
The girls.
being treated differently? Yes. Or what is your take on that?
I understood from my childhood friends that they had one and only one option for their lives, which was that they were going to get married and have children. And in the 70s, most girls probably thought about getting married and having children. But even at that age, I had no interest in dolls. I didn't want to play girly stuff. I never did. I wanted a chemistry set, and I wanted to climb and play war and, you know, play with rocks. And, you know, back then we didn't have sophisticated toys. So I was very creative in creating, you know, play scenarios, and I would be orchestrating what the kids would do. And so I knew from a fairly early age that my choices and my future was going to be very different than my playmates' future, because my parents always told me that I could be anything I wanted to be, and I wanted to be a doctor. And my parents always told me, well, then you'll be a doctor. You just have to work hard and be good, and you'll be a doctor. And my girlfriends, like Tima, you know, my kid friends, you know, when I told them that I was going to be a doctor, they would look at me like I was insane. And they kept telling me, you know, girls can't be doctors. Only boys can be doctors. And I was, you know, and of course I just rejected that. I mean, my personality was such that I would never accept anybody telling me that I couldn't do it. But I began to understand that that was true for them. And when you live in an environment where every woman you see is covered from head to toe, and you get how they are deferential to their husbands and how they are home focused. You can't escape that. I mean, you live in Morocco, you live in Syria, you can't escape that. That's just what you see. And so I knew as a child growing up that all that I was seeing around me didn't apply to me. And it was a comfort to me. It was comforting to me to know that what's normal there isn't going to apply to me because I can be a doctor. And that was impactful for me.
Okay. So did you serve in the Middle East theater?
I did, yes.
Okay, so after basic training, where did you go?
Well, my first duty station was Norfolk, Virginia. And I was served as just a defense counsel. And so my job in Norfolk was to defend Marines and sailors, mostly sailors, who got into trouble and were either being kicked out of the Navy administratively through administrative hearings or who were getting court-martialed. And there was a significant backlog of cases when I got to the Norfolk Legal Services Office. And that meant that I had this huge caseload and I just had to churn through it. And there was no training, there was no easing into it. It was just like, okay, Lieutenant Keith, here you go. This is your stuff. And so you kind of had to learn on the job and learn as you go. And because Norfolk is the biggest naval base in the world, and it also has the largest transient personnel unit, it had all of the people that were incarcerated would be processed through Norfolk, all the people that were coming off of medical holds or whatever. There were all this broad range of issues that you would come across. People who'd been court-martialed but didn't receive a dishonorable or bad conduct discharge, they would come to Norfolk to be processed some other way. So I had a real variety of cases, from very serious allegations to behavioral issues that were not really criminal, but just irritating. And so you learned a lot about human beings and the things that they come to the table with. And I lived such a sort of regimented life myself that it was very weird for me to run across people who did very strange things. You know, I would get the cases of people involved in sexual misconduct and people back then, don't ask, don't tell was a big issue. And so I got some of those cases. I got cases of a lot of people who were just refused to show up to work, which in the Navy is a very, very big deal, especially if you are missing a ship's movement when you do it. But also people who just couldn't get along, personality disorders. I had never heard of a personality disorder until I started working at Norfolk. People who were involved in violence, a lot of drug charges. We had zero tolerance for drug use in the Navy. And so it would shock me that somebody would take the risk of getting caught, you know, but they did. And so I would have to figure out how to defend these people. And so not only was I learning how to be compassionate and tolerant towards people whose lives were more complicated than my own, but I also had to think really creatively, and I had to become an advocate for them. I had to become an advocate and try to explain why somebody would do something that I thought made no sense. And it was an interesting experience for me because on one hand, I'd get a young person, often young person, in my office, and they had done something really, really stupid. And so my first instinct was to rail at them for the stupidity. But then I'd turn around and have to be their advocate. And so I would go into the court-martial or I'd go into the administrative hearing, and I would passionately and zealously defend this person. And that shocked them. It shocked them that I could go from, berating them for being inane to being their best advocate, their strongest supporter, the person that saw the good in them, and highlighted that. And that, I think, was really formative for me as understanding how to advocate for people, even people who do things that I don't care for. But I knew that I was their strength, and I liked that. But I didn't like some of the personal drama that I got pulled into in that role. I didn't like seeing this sort of seedy underbelly of human, behavior. It made me jaded. I saw a lot of lies, a lot of mean and unkind things, and it started to harden me in a way that I didn't like. And so I knew that I was never going to make a career out of being a defense counsel.
Okay. So where did you go in the Middle East?
I
You
was
went to Norfolk, and then you went to
right.
the Middle East?
Yes, I was a junior lieutenant in Norfolk. In fact, I was the most junior lieutenant in Norfolk. And
What do you mean the most?
well, because of the way I commissioned. Most of the people who commission into the JAG Corps do their training their second year of law school summer. And so they are gaining seniority. By the time they graduate, they put on full lieutenant. I didn't commission until I had already graduated from law school. So I was a little bit behind the curve in terms of seniority and time and rank. And so I was a lieutenant junior grade for about 6 months. And my lineal number was beneath everybody else's because they had commissioned while they were in law school. So I was the most junior in the sense of my lineal number and my rank, although we all had the same amount of actual experience. So, anyway, my time in Norfolk was awesome, and I had a really good time. But every time a boondoggle or an opportunity came up, I'd always throw up my hand. Not because I thought I was going to get it, but because I wanted to establish a pattern that I was the kind of person who would volunteer for additional responsibility. And I figured if I established that pattern, then when I was more senior and a really good plum job came up, I would have, gotten people's attention, and they would say, oh, well, let's give it to Pam since we've turned her down so many times. That was my thinking. So the first thing that came up when I was in Norfolk was, maybe 6 or 7 months into it, was a Unitas cruise. And a Unitas cruise is a group of ships that leave from Norfolk and they sail around South America. And it's really a goodwill tour, if you will, of the Navy. And that's like a boondoggle. That's a plum job. You get to stop in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro and all these other countries. Now, at that point by then, I had lived in Rio de Janeiro, but there were lots of places in South America I had never been, and I just thought it would be really fun, and I wanted to spend time on the ship, so I really wanted to do that. So I put up my hand for the first one that came up, but I was way too junior to get that. And I figured, well, if I put up my hand for the first one, when the next one comes around next year, maybe I have a better shot of getting it. The second thing that came up was this job in Bahrain, which was the Legal Services Office Detachment Officer in Charge job. And again, I was a junior lieutenant. I had no business being officer in charge of anything. So I put up my hand with the full expectation that I would not get that job. I was too junior for it, and like I said, I assumed that somebody else would volunteer as well, and I assumed that somebody more senior to myself would do it. But I put my hand up, and by the time that happened, I had been in Norfolk for close to a year. And because I had such a heavy caseload, I had established my reputation. I mean, they saw that I was a good litigator. They saw that I could manage my schedule well. I got positive feedback from the units that I had been serving. I was quick, I was responsive. And so I got ordered to the commanding officer's office to talk about this job in Bahrain, and I fully expected him to say, hey, Pam, don't want you to get discouraged. You're not going to get this, but, thanks for chiming up. That was my expectation. I got marched into his office, and he says, hey, Pam, do you really want this job? And, that's a kind of question where there's only one answer to, right? Right?
Yeah.
And so I, of course, said, of course I do. Yes, absolutely. And so he said, well, I'm going to recommend that you get this. And I was stunned. I was, he said, I think you're ready. I think you've got the litigation chops. I think you have the military bearing, and I'm going to recommend that you get it. And in Navy speak, that means you're going. That's not a recommendation. So that's what happened. You know, in March of 1997, I was deployed to Bahrain. And while I had lived in the Middle East before, I'd never lived in the Gulf states, which are even more conservative than the countries that I had lived in. And they were hotter and they were more barren. And so it was not, you know, par for the course for me. It was very much a revelation. And I really, really had a great tour there, despite some of the challenges.
Okay. So, I mean, okay, so what was it like? Tell me about it.
It was hotter than you could possibly imagine.
Did you see any combat?
I did not see combat. At the time that this was going on,
Unless it was in a courtroom, right?
yeah, well, I definitely saw that. But the time that this was going on, the United States was enforcing sanctions against Saddam Hussein, and UN inspectors were in Iraq to inspect and try to remove his weapons of mass destruction. And so most of the Navy operations were twofold. One was policing the no-fly zone because Saddam Hussein had attacked Kurds in the north and had some problems with folks in the south. So he had been, we had established, the UN had established these sort of imaginary no-fly zones. And so the United States air capacity, which from our aircraft carriers, would fly out and fly over those areas to make sure that none of Saddam Hussein's planes were flying into those areas. And I'm sure it also had some intelligence gathering capacity there too. The second major mission was marine interdiction of smuggling out of oil or in of weapons or whatever. So the Navy component was policing the Gulf waters to ensure that Saddam Hussein was not smuggling out oil to make money that was, you know, sanctioned. So it was a heavy operational period. And if you remember that time, it wasn't like Saddam Hussein was real compliant or cooperative. The UN inspection was something he had to agree to end the Gulf War. So he agreed to it, but he agreed to it in theory more than in practice. And so when the UN inspectors were there, they would be denied access to certain buildings. There'd be roads that were blocked. There'd be, you know, a key to open a critical door was missing. And so it would be this, what I call the inspection okie doke, right? It was always a game. And so, you know, every once in a while he'd get into a snit and just say, oh, UN inspectors, you have to go. And so he would kick the UN inspectors out, and then we would ramp up and prepare for attack. And then as soon as he got clear that we're about to attack him or bomb or do whatever, he would back down. And then we would, you know, retrench, and then, you know, the UN inspectors would come back and then they'd start to do their thing. And it became almost a pattern where he would get to a point where he was irritated, and then he would do something stupid. We'd get all rammed up, and then, you know, we would calm down. But the operational tempo was very high. I mean, we had a lot of ships in the area. We had a lot of aircraft in the air. There was always danger involved with that. I witnessed a death at sea of a pilot who flew into one of his own squadron planes. It was just an air mishap, but he died. And so I got to witness a funeral at sea, and I mean, that was extremely impactful and emotional. I didn't know the man. He wasn't part of my unit, but when you're in the Navy, even if you're just visiting a ship, even if you're just there for a few days, you're part of the team, you're part of the unit. And it impacted me very profoundly because he left, you know, 2 young boys and a wife, and I mean, it was very, very impactful. So there were plenty of things going on, but not full on combat as we know it in Iraq and Afghanistan now.
Okay. Did you see a lot of, or witness a lot of casualties?
No, again, that was the main thing that I saw. Was we had a lot of anxiety. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of anxiety around us, largely because Saddam Hussein was unpredictable, and we were very concerned about him using anthrax. And so there was a lot of anxiety around that. there were plenty of times when we were spun up and put into what we called ThreatCon Charlie, which was basically lockdown of all U.S. personnel. So we couldn't leave our houses or apartments. So our only place where we could maneuver was on base or go home. You couldn't be out and about in town. You couldn't hang out. And there was a lot of that. We would end up in ThreatCon Charlie every few months. And that's a very stressful place to be, because you're told that something is happening and that you're in danger, but you're not told what's happening. And so you have that sense of anxiety of threat. But nothing ever came of that, thank goodness. But you know.
Tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences.
My most memorable experiences. I had a case off of the USS Tarawa, which is a LHD, a marine carrying ship, amphibious ship. And the Marine that was my client was a young Mexican kid who was otherwise a very good Marine, but he had a very bad night. And he got in a dispute with his shipmate and his fellow Marine, and he hit him with the bar glass in the face. And I'm not even sure he intended to swing, but somehow he did. And he cut this guy's face open from his forehead to his chin. And the Marine that was injured required hundreds of stitches and almost lost his eye. My client was incredibly remorseful, wanted to plead guilty because there was no question that he had done it. The problem was that he didn't intend to do it. It was just a drunken kerfuffle, if you will. So I was working hard to try to get him a pretrial agreement, which is one of those, he'll plead guilty to a charge as long as he gets, reduced sentence and that sort of thing. And that was very common in the Navy. And so what made the case interesting was not my client. What made the case interesting was the commanding officer, who was the convening authority for the court-martial, he was an 05 in the Marines. And so he was a lieutenant colonel, and he was in the Navy. A lieutenant colonel is a significant, that 05 is this very significant rank, but there's a lot of 05s, especially in the Navy JAG Corps. There's a lot of 05s. So that's not a rank that I found particularly intimidating, but in the Marine Corps, it's a very, very big deal. It's, it's almost, next to God. And so this guy was just an interesting character. He refused to talk to me about the pretrial agreement through any methodology. I mean, I was staying on the ship. The Marine Expeditionary Unit was in Kuwait doing war games, practicing whatever they were practicing, Marine landings and maneuvers and whatever. So they were deep in the heart of Kuwait, and he refused to talk to me on the phone. We had international maritime satellite communication. He would refuse to talk to me on that. He wouldn't answer emails. He would not talk to me about the pretrial agreement. But as counsel, it was my duty to explore this. I had to give it my full attention. So I ended up having to take an amphibious hovercraft into Kuwait, getting in a helicopter, flying to where the Marines were, getting in a Humvee to drive to his command tent and meet this guy. And I call it my Nathan Jessup moment, because when I got there, he was smoking a cigar. He had his flak jacket and his his battle dress uniform on, like everybody in there. And he was getting his hair cut. Somebody was cutting his hair. And he made me stand there for a good 40 minutes waiting for him to wrap up whatever he was doing. And then he pulls me to another attempt, and he starts to berate me. He starts to lecture me and berate me in this really, really thick Southern accent about the values of the Marine Corps and how I, by trying to get my client a pretrial agreement, I didn't understand the values of the Marine Corps, and he was a scumbag, and he needs to play his, and I'm sitting there going, and I would have been perfectly okay had he simply told me that he wasn't going to give me a pretrial agreement and that my guy has to take his lumps and bumps. I was okay with that. But he really came at me like, how dare I even, suggest such a thing? And so I kind of got back I got my backup and responded to him like, Colonel, do you get to pick your missions? Are there missions that you give your full attention to and missions that you slack off on? And when I challenged him like that, he was shocked, and everybody in the tent was shocked. I said, look, this is my job. This is my duty. This is what I'm supposed to do. And every Marine that I represent is entitled to my best effort. That's what I'm supposed to do. So if your suggestion is I shouldn't do my job vis-a-vis this Marine because you don't like what he did, then that's telling me to slack off my job and kind of pick and choose my missions. And when he heard that, it was pretty shocking. So that was a memorable experience, both because of his backing down and realizing that he kind of crossed the line. And I could do that because he wasn't my commanding officer, and I certainly didn't talk to him in a disrespectful tone, but I certainly was able to hold my own in a way that none of the Marines who worked for him were able to do.
So what did he say at that moment?
Well, he gave well, I'm not suggesting that, Lieutenant. I'm just saying, and I was like, yeah, well, with all due respect to the values of the Marine Corps, the values of the United States Department of Navy is you've got to do your job to your best ability no matter what it is. And he backed down and he kind of grumbled and grumbled. I mean, he still didn't give me the pretrial agreement, but he at least gave me the respect that I was due trying to do my job. And I ended up having to spend the night out there because there was no method to get back to the ship. And so that was my first experience, bunking. There was only 2 other women out there who were Marine officers. There were no other women. I got to ride in the tanks, and the guys were really, really nice to me after that. So I had to get to eat an MRE and watch them do their war games. And, so it was my first real sort of in it experience embedded amongst Marines doing what Marines do. And so that was really fun at the end of the day. And in the end, I got a great result for my client because the colonel was so sure that the guy was going to be not only convicted, but kicked out of the Marine Corps. And I decided tactically that I was going to have my client admit everything he did, take full responsibility, and beg to stay in the Marine Corps. And then when the officers that were going to testify against my client got on the stand, they were trying to claim that he was a scumbag Marine and irredeemable and blah, blah, blah. And their fitness, his fitness records completely contradicted everything they said. And so I get these Marines on the stand, these spit and polished Marines in their dress uniforms in the stand, and I'm like ripping them apart because they're testifying completely contradictory to their own assessment of this Marine. And the judge thought that was entertaining and amusing, and so he decided not to kick my guy out of the Marine Corps. And so that was a really positive result. I don't know what happened to that Marine. Oftentimes, even if they beat the bad conduct discharge, they get administratively separated. But it was a victory, a little minor victory for me.
Right. Okay. How long were you stationed there?
19 months.
Okay. And so the tour was overall.
It was great. There were definitely some extremely challenging times in that.
Such as?
Well, like I said, it was a very high operational tempo.
Right.
And so there were a lot of ships, and there was a lot of time that I spent on ships. So I would fly to a ship, stay on that ship, and quite often go from that ship to another ship. There were times when, we're working around the clock. So when the ships would come into the Persian Gulf from the East Coast, they would come through the Mediterranean. From the West Coast, they would come through the, around South Africa up into the Middle East. And so there were ships that would come into the area would often have a lot of military justice issues that have piled up on their crews over there. Either people who missed ship's movement, people who got caught in drugs, people who got into trouble in their port calls, and so on. So there were plenty of times when I was working around the clock trying to process these cases, and there were also some emotional challenges. I mean, there's some very challenging cases, and there were some times when I had to stand in opposition to officers very senior to myself. And that's a scary thing when you're a lieutenant, to have to tell a captain you're not going to do what he wants you to do, and to stand your ground. And I was isolated in Bahrain. My commanding officer was in Naples, Florida. So it was just me. I didn't have a lot of backup. And so when I was asked to do things that I thought were in contravention to my duties, I had to walk that fine line of, am I doing what's right, or am I violating direct orders? I mean, even if they weren't in my chain of command, they were my superior officers. And to tell a captain in 06 that you're not going to do what he tells you to do is, I mean, by that point, you have a lot of respect for rank. You don't, that's just not something that anybody would be normally comfortable with. But there were a couple times when they wanted results, a certain result, and told me they were going to get that result. And I was like, oh, no, you're not. So there were times when that was challenging. And plus, it was just extremely hot, extremely uncomfortable sometimes, and very, very far from home. And I don't think people can truly appreciate how hard it is to be that far away from your family until for that long,
Right.
Until they've done it themselves.
Right. Okay, did you, were you awarded any medals or citations? And for what?
I got 2 Navy Commendation medals, and those were just, and I've got some recognition for the work I did in counseling services, tax preparation. So while most of my duty was criminal defense, I also was the only lawyer that a lot of sailors could talk to when they came into the area when they had legal problems. So they would get to the area, they'd finally get their mail call, and then they'd get their Dear John letter, or they would get a tax lien, or they would get car being repossessed, or a variety of other typical legal problems. And when you're that far from home, not much they can do. So I was often the person that they would come to talk through what their options were. I'd make calls back to the States to try to sort things out. One of the things that I saw was sort of predatory lending and issues that guys would get into and getting in debt. So that was kind of part, so I got recognized for that. And the commendation medals are just, they're when obviously you get, if you just do your job, you don't get a medal. If you do your job well, you get a certain kind of medal. And if you do your job very well, you get another kind of medal. And as you get more senior, the medals get more substantive. So I was pretty proud of the 2 that I got.
Okay. How did you stay in touch with your family while you were overseas?
That was when I learned email. Up until that point, I was very resistant to the idea. But because of the time difference, there was really no way to talk to people by phone. Mm-hmm. So I learned email. I learned the internet. And, but even so, it's extremely isolating. And one of the biggest challenges that I had in Bahrain was that my mother was diagnosed with cancer while I was out there. Mm-hmm. And I knew my mother well enough to know that she would try to play it down like it was no big deal. Right. And, she was fine and she'll get through it. And I was a wreck because I was not in a position to come home and see for myself how she was doing. And she wasn't sick enough at the time for me to get any kind of compassionate leave or anything. But when your mom tells you she's got, stage 3 esophageal cancer, you freak out. And for a while, I was very freaked out.
So I heard you complain about the food and basic training. How was it after basic training?
Well, you don't eat on base after basic training. The food in the Navy on the ships is awful, with a couple exceptions. If a ship has gotten an underway replenishment and they got fresh fruits and stuff on board, it could be pretty good. It could be decent. They make the bread on the ship. I don't know what they make it with, but I was not a fan. The other exception is the supply ships. The Navy Supply Corps has ships that they sail into the area to help to replenish the other ships. And the supply ships had good food, as you can imagine. So I love doing cases on supply ships because they had good food. But the rest of the food, I don't ever want to hear the word slider again. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at 2:00 in the morning. Like it was awful.
Okay. What did you do for entertainment?
Depending on where I was. I'm a huge tennis player. I love to play tennis. So I played as much tennis as I could get away with. In Bahrain, we didn't have, I don't think there was a golf course, but in the United Arab Emirates, there were several golf courses that were that had just opened, and they were very cheap for us. So when I was down in the UAE, I would play golf, usually with people from the units that I was visiting. I love to cook, so I cooked a lot, and I needed to cook because I couldn't stand the food on base. And we watched movies, we hung out together. When we were in a good place, we would, operationally, we would go out into town. But in Bahrain, there was a pretty significant Shia Muslim population. They were the minority, but they were vocal and very religious, and they didn't particularly cotton to Americans being around. So there was always a bit of a danger associated with going out into town, especially by yourself. So you were not allowed to go out in town by yourself. Right. But we did what typically people do when we were allowed to be out and about.
Okay. Right. So what did you do on leave?
I came home, or I would travel through Europe. I did a big European trip because that was sort of the halfway point. Mm-hmm. But coming home was very, very long flight. So you didn't do that all that often.
Right. Okay. Have we covered all the places that you traveled while you were in the service?
No, I had one other duty station.
Where was that?
I was stationed as the judge advocate for the Navy Computers and Telecommunications Command, which was called NAVCOM Telcom.
Uh-huh. And what did that entail?
I was the judge advocate that advised the commanding officer of that command. So that command owned all of the computers and telecommunications functions of the Navy. And there were detachments or offices all over the world, computer telecommunications, you can imagine, all over the world. Mm-hmm. And some of them were housed where we have our cryptology and intelligence functions, and some of them were not. But when I got to that job, they had just had a realignment of resources such that all of the military justice issues became taken up by the local bases rather than the command back in Washington, D.C. So the job should have been really exciting, but when I got there, it had changed significantly, so it had a lot less of a military justice component to it. Mm-hmm. So it was not quite as exciting as I wanted it to be.
Separating from the service, mm-hmm. Where were you when that was kind of closing to an end?
In Washington, D.C.
Uh-huh. So you left there and then you were stationed, and your next duty station was back in Washington?
Right. So I left Bahrain. I went to Washington. I had extended in Bahrain so that I would get orders to Washington. That's where I wanted to go. And I had been thinking about getting out. I mean, my obligation was up. And at that time in the Navy JAG Corps, all of the JAG's initial tours were as a U.S. Navy Reserve and a reserve status, and then you would have to augment to regular Navy status. And that was only for the JAGs that they wanted to stay in. And at the time, there were far more JAGs that wanted to stay in than that the Navy needed. Right. Because they used junior JAGs to do military justice, but as you get more senior, it's less and less military justice oriented, and it's more and more oriented towards operational type counseling and status of forces agreements and international, and there's a component that's military justice, but then at that point it's either the most serious cases or from being a military judge. So at that point I realized that I either was going to stay in or I was going to get out. And I did the paperwork to stay in, and I was selected to stay in, or at least the first part of that. But when I interviewed for jobs in Washington, D.C., I got a great job. And it was, I understood at that point that all of my Navy experience, while really, really cool, wasn't sharpening my legal skills in the way that a private legal practice does.
Right.
And my writing skills were being degraded because most of Navy legal practice is not written, it's oral. Every once in a while you write briefs for a judge on a unique or novel issue, but very seldomly. So I wasn't sharpening my writing skills, and the money on the outside was, double or triple what I was making in the Navy.
Right.
So I was like, look, I got to get out. So I got out and I got a job, and, and ended up in a law firm, and it was almost like starting completely over. I mean, so many things from law school I'd already forgotten because I hadn't used them. And so it was a bit of that was a challenging transition. But I made it, and I survived it, and ended up with a decent legal career.
So what happened between now and then and now?
Nothing. I just did the law thing. I was an associate at a large firm in D.C. I moved to another law firm in D.C., and that was intellectually challenging, and obviously decent compensation, and I made good friends. I learned a lot. I was able to put into practice my oral advocacy skills, my ability to think quickly on my feet. All of that really, really came in handy. And the trick of being a really good lawyer in the area that I was practicing in was being able to understand facts and marry them up with the law, come up with a legal theory, but understand how to marshal your facts around that. And that was the thing that I think a lot of junior lawyers had struggled with, was that they could understand how to quote law all day, but they weren't fact focused, they weren't people focused. They didn't understand how to marshal a fact and bring it out and say, highlight it for someone and say, this is why, you've got to find our way. So I found that I was very, I had a skill set that was very useful for me in my legal career from that Navy experience.
Okay.
And just the comfort of oral advocacy.
Okay, so what do you, after the service, this is where we're at, so where are you at now in the future away from the service?
I lived in Washington, D.C. for 9 years. I practiced there. I joined a more boutique type firm. Boutique is probably a misnomer because it's not a small firm, but it was a firm that specialized in labor and employment law. And so I moved to the Midwest, initially in Indianapolis and then in Chicago. And it was February of 2011. And I got a call from a recruiter about a job in Florida, and I didn't know a soul in Florida. And I was like, I'm not moving to Florida. But I figured, I might as well take the call. There's nothing wrong with that. And when they, after the initial phone interview, they wanted to bring me down for an interview. I mean, I was like, Florida in February? Of course, yes. So I just looked at it as an opportunity to come to Florida in the winter. And I came down and interviewed and talked to people, and it looked like a really great opportunity. And so I struggled with it for a little bit, but then I was like, look, I got to take this job. So I moved down to South Florida. And
where'd you come from in the Midwest?
Chicago.
Oh, okay. All right, and how long were you there?
I was in Chicago for about 9 months, and then I was in Indianapolis for almost 2 years. And so I'd been in the Midwest for close to 3 years, and I loved Chicago. I struggled with the weather. And I don't think I even realized how much I was struggling with the weather till I moved here.
And how was work there? Was work good?
In Chicago?
Yeah.
Yeah. The area, the specialty that I have in the law is a specialty that was declining in the law practice because fewer and fewer employers are unionized.
Uh-huh.
But I loved doing the union work. And so that was largely what motivated me to come down here, was that I was going to a position that was really focused almost exclusively on the traditional labor side.
Okay. So, all right, so where are we at today? You moved here, and what kind of law did you practice when you got here?
I practiced traditional labor law. The employer that I worked for had a large unionized workforce, and I worked principally with the workforce that was in the nuclear division, which is really interesting because you had the labor law, which is esoteric in its own way, and then you put on top of that nuclear regulation, which is very complex as well.
Is that for FP&L?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was cool. I mean, my job was, I flew, we had 5 nuclear power plants around the country, and 3 outside of, 2 in Florida and 3 outside of Florida. And my job was to go around and deal with those issues. Most of it was arbitration. Some of it was strike preparedness, negotiations, that kind of thing. And some of it was just strategy and how do we deal with problems and things that are coming up. So it was a good gig.
And so your interest now today?
Well, today I'm a candidate for U.S. Senate, and I came to a place in my career at that point where I had done a lot of the things, pretty much everything I wanted to do. I didn't feel like I was growing and learning as much as I had in the past. And I had always had the sense that, to whom much is given, much is expected. And while it was good and fun being an attorney and making good money and all of that, there was a part of me that was always, there were so many people that so needed an advocate, and I was really beginning to chomp at the bit at trying to be an advocate in a different way or on a different scale. So I thought about going into politics, and I had absolutely no idea how to do it. And I started to think about how do you transition into politics, and at that point, and the first time I really started to think about it was in 2013, when Marco Rubio, the Florida senator, gave the Republican response to President Obama's State of the Union speech. And I was sitting on my couch, and I'll never forget it because it was an epiphany like the one I had about going to law school. The guy was just terrible. I mean, he was just terrible. His presentation wasn't smooth. It wasn't convincing. He was sweaty and cotton-mouthed and drinking in the middle of his speech, and the speech itself was utterly substanceless. And I just looked at him and I was like, how did he get there? How did he get to be in the United States Senate? I could do that. And I mean, yes, I disagreed with the substance of what he said, whatever there was, but I also felt like this person is not doing anything positive for the people of the state of Florida. And there was so much needed to be done. He wasn't doing anything positive to move our country forward. And the one thing that he did do, he kind of backed off of. And so it was really that moment that I started crystallizing in my mind this desire to serve in politics at the federal level, because that's the law aspect that I know. And I started ruminating about it. Now, of course, when that first thought comes into your mind, the first thing you do is say, don't be ridiculous. You can't do that. But when that thought doesn't go away and you keep coming back to it, and you keep kind of thinking on it, and it doesn't go away. And that when I knew that it wasn't some flight of fancy, that I really, really did want to do this, then it became a question of, well, how do you do this? And in August of last year, the impetus, things with work had changed, and I realized, a big election's coming up, and Marco Rubio had made noises about running for president, but I didn't think he was actually going to do it. But I just felt like, you know what? This is my opportunity. He was up for re-election. I was like, this is my opportunity to take this guy on. And perhaps it was arrogant, or perhaps it was delusional, or whatever, but I deeply believe that if I took him on head to head, I'd be the better advocate. I believed that. I know Marco Rubio went to law school, but he's no kind of advocate. And so I made the decision that I was going to drop everything and make a run for this. And I remember the moment where I came to peace with the idea that I actually was going to do this, because, your heart races and you're sweaty and I was in bed, I was looking up at the ceiling, asking myself, are you really going to do this? Are you really going to do this? Are you really going to do this? And at the end of the day, I just said, okay, I'm going to do this. And the first thing I did was call my parents and call my brother and my best friend Judy. And all of them responded the same way, which is, you can totally do this. You were born to do this. This is exactly what you're supposed to do. And because they gave me that initial response, I felt emboldened. And so then I called all my friends and all of my extended friends and family, and all of them said, yep, you're smart enough. You've got what it takes. You totally can do this. And so I pursued it, and I left FPL, and I started putting together my thoughts, and I had a couple people that I considered to be really, really smart, and started talking through my positions with them and building a platform. And then came the drudgery of trying to figure out how to put together a website and video and photos and all things I knew nothing about. And I just kind of stumbled my way through to put together a campaign. And I went up to Washington a couple times and met some people. I had worked on a political campaign as a volunteer over the fall. So I started looking at the people that I was around and seeing how that functioned. And I tried to put together a team and people to work for me. And slowly but surely, little things came into place. And there were a lot of times, even up through that fall and winter, that I thought, this is going to go off the rails. There's no way I can pull this off. But every step, somehow something fell into place. And so I launched in sort of January. There were definitely things that weren't working. I had hired an outfit to help with fundraising. There were things that I needed to learn. There were things that you would never think of that came up. And so it was a very, very steep learning curve, and it's still a very steep learning curve. But things are getting better and better. And I think that helps you keep going when you get terrified, is that when I compared February to January, February was much better. And when I compared March to February, March was much better. And by the time I actually started getting out and talking to voters, there was like a steep increase of activity and response, and I was getting such positive responses from voters. I was getting such positive feedback that it started to really start to crystallize that, this could actually happen. There were things that happened that I totally did not anticipate. I fully expected that the party, because I didn't know party politics. I mean, that's not something I was exposed to. I have been a loyal Democrat all of my life, and I've given to many Democratic candidates. But I didn't know the inner workings of the party to any extent. And my expectation was that no reason why they wouldn't be supportive of me. I have the background, I have the platform, I'm polished. I just assumed that I was exactly what the Democratic Party was looking for. It wasn't until I was sort of in it that I realized that they had already made up their mind as to who they wanted their candidate to be, and they were not particularly pleased that I wasn't deferential to that choice. And there are a lot of things that happened sort of in that February, March, April timeframe that just take your breath away.
Talking about 2015?
Yeah, I mean, just unbelievable. And so there are times when you just feel like you got kicked in the gut and you have no idea what you're doing and you're terrified and you're freaked out. And all you can do is put one foot in front of the other and keep on going. And that's kind of how I've gotten to where I am now in July.
What do you mean there's things that happen? Like what?
Just, certainly there were, I had meetings with people where things were said and they weren't technically promises. I'm not an idiot. I know the difference between an assertion and a promise. But there were definitely assertions and things that I was told that weren't real. And that were really designed solely to get me out of this race. And had I taken them at face value, I'd be in a very different place. I was complete.
Give me one example.
Well, I think there were representations made to me about not running for Senate and running for a congressional race instead. And the light of that was, oh, well, you'll get all this support. You'll get all this help.
Do you think that was because you're a woman, because you're a person of color, or what do you think? What's your take?
I'm not sure that it has anything to do with race or gender. It's just that they had their guy, and that was that. And they didn't want him to be challenged. They wanted a no primary race. And they wanted him to raise a lot of money and have it in his coffers for the general. And they figured, and this was things that I learned later on, that their inner machinations and workings would ensure that nobody would challenge this person. And to a large extent, I think that did in fact happen. I think they put tremendous pressure on a lot of other politicians not to run against him. And they didn't. Because that was what the party told him. I don't know that to be true, but that's the way it looks from where I sit. But there are always renegades, right? And there are always people who don't necessarily play by the team rules. So I think the party's going to have a robust primary whether they like it or not. And in the meantime, I'm still here. And I don't have the name recognition, and I'm not a millionaire, and I don't have major sponsors. But what I do have is the ability to connect with voters and to and to talk to them. That's very different than what they typically get from politicians, because I've never been a politician. I don't sound like one. I don't relate like one. And a lot of voters find that refreshing.
Okay, I just have a few more questions for you. What did you think of your fellow officers, fellow soldiers?
Well, I don't call them soldiers or sailors, but I have so much respect and such a fondness for anybody really who has served in uniform, but particularly for my fellow sailors. It is a special fraternity, brotherhood, sisterhood, whatever you want to call it. It is a special, special thing to be part of that, because you speak a common language. You have a shared experience. You have a shared value set. And over the years, I have found that that aspect of my background has created more bridges to people whom I would otherwise never have anything in common with. I can sit down and have a fantastic conversation with a World War II vet, a Vietnam vet, a Korea vet, men who are of a different race, different worldview, totally conservative, totally different attitudes, and still bond and connect with them. Because they see me, and at first they think, I got nothing in common with this lady. And then we start talking Navy talk, and then it's like, oh yeah, I remember that, and I did that, and what about this? And you instantly connect. And so that's something you don't know will happen when you're in the service. That's not something that you really appreciate until you're out of the service.
Did you use your GI Bill at all?
I used the VA loan
Okay.
to buy a house, and I didn't use any other aspect of the GI Bill because I had finished law school and I was pretty much done with school.
Okay. You maintain any close friendships?
Oh yes, very much so.
Good.
In fact, one of my dearest and closest friends just got promoted to admiral in the Navy, and that is a very big deal. He is the deputy judge advocate of the entire Navy.
Wow.
And he was a lieutenant commander when we were friends back in Bahrain. Mm-hmm. And we've maintained a very close and tight friendship all these years.
Good. Okay, two more questions. Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
And how did your service and experiences affect your life?
When you serve in the military, you learn that you are part of something bigger than yourself. And you learn that it is an honor. It is an honor to put yourself on the line for others. It's a struggle sometimes, and it can be a sacrifice, but it's an honor because not everybody gets to do it. And I found that you get a much more profound sense of the bonds that exist between us Americans. You are forced to see more of what makes us the same than what makes us different. And I think that the whole point of being in uniform was to make everybody the same. The whole point of people from all different walks of life and all different races and gender and worldview, they put on the uniform and they are indoctrinated into being the same. And that means that they all have value. They all have a part of the mission, and every part of the mission is valuable. And everybody has to pull their weight. And everybody has to care about everybody else. Whether they're in your unit or not in your unit, they don't even have to be in your same service. But you value them. And so I think that profoundly influenced how I look at being an American. And I think that marries up with my childhood of living outside of the United States for so many years that I valued so much being an American. And those two experiences together helped me both to be positive and optimistic, and really, really loving what it is that this country's all about. I love America. I love Americans. I think there is nothing and nowhere that compares to the freedom and the opportunity and the individuality and the quirkiness and the fun that we have here. And the reason we have such an amazing country is because of the people in it. I can appreciate people with radically different political views than my own because I'm just happy that they're here. I'm happy that we have conservatives. I'm happy that we have people from small towns and big towns and people who value individual work and whatever. I mean, I love that we have people who value different things than I do because that's what makes our country special. I have lived in places where everybody not only has the same religion, but dresses exactly the same, comes from the same culture, and there's just unbelievable social pressure to conform. And I know for a fact how suffocated and unhappy I would be in a country like that. And so I can't but rejoice about the fact that I live in a place where I can be precisely who and what I want to be, and that I can put it all on the line to do what I want to do. That's a miracle. That's a blessing. That's an amazing, amazing thing. And it's the thing worth fighting for, and it's the thing worth dying for.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for the interview. I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for your interview, and I'm sure that we have a lot more we could talk about, but we're running out of time. So, is there anything you feel like you left out of the interview?
I don't think so. I did a lot of talking, Carlton.
It's really good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your service
Thank you.
and your time.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.